Order! Order! You are an incorrigible delinquent at times. Behave yourself, man!
The UN Security Council has held an emergency session to discuss the suspected gas attack on a rebel-held town in Syria. The attack is believed to have killed more than 70 people, including children. The Syrian government has denied responsibility, while its ally, Russia, says the gas came from rebel weapons on the ground. But those claims have been widely rejected by Western governments, as our chief international correspondent Lise Doucette reports.
All 5-year-old Ibrahim knows as he went to sleep in his Spider-Man suit and woke up in a nightmare. Now he's in a hospital bed, grandparents at his side. Ibrahim and Teba's father among the dead, the many victims of a toxic cloud which enveloped their village yesterday, breathing in the poisonous gases as they slept.
My grandchildren were sleeping. Everyone woke up to a loud noise. They went outside, and that's when they came across the chemical attack. They just fell to the floor and died.
World leaders arriving here in Brussels this morning have seen attacks in Syria time and again. Many in no doubt who is behind this latest atrocity.
I've seen absolutely nothing to suggest that, or rather to lead us to think that it is anything but the regime.
I called out to the UN chief Antonio Guterres. Was this attack a test of the UN's resolve?
I don't think we need to classify if it is a test or not. Everything we do is a test to a certain extent. This is a moment of truth.
With every attack in Syria, the words grow ever stronger, but they're essentially the same. Condemnation of yet another atrocity, calls for an investigation, and warnings of a price to pay. But time and again, it's Syrian civilians who continue to pay the heaviest price of all. Russia says the Syrian military did carry out an airstrike. But its military spokesman said they struck what he called a terrorist warehouse with an arsenal of toxic substances. A weapons expert told the BBC the chemicals were most probably dropped from the air.
The claim is rather implausible. If a facility on the ground was hit by munitions dropped from the air, you would get other materials as well as the particularly poisonous materials being spread. There have been accidents in production plants in the past, before chemical weapons were banned. These haven't produced the same sort of spread of materials as we're seeing here. So this leads me, on the evidence that we can see so far, to believe this poison was from weapons dropped from the air.
This horrific attack is the deadliest Syria has seen in 4 years. The world said then that President Assad had to give up all his chemical weapons. But it's clear, Syria is still a country with the worst kind of weapons and the will to use them. Lise Doucette, BBC News, Brussels.
Well, let's talk to Nick Bryant, who's at the UN headquarters in New York. And Nick, the UN Security Council has been meeting there to draft a resolution on these suspected chemical attacks, but there have been some very bad-tempered exchanges.
Fiona, a very angry and very impassioned emergency meeting of the Security Council this morning, and the British ambassador pointing the finger of blame at the Assad regime, but also blasting Russia and China for vetoing a UN resolution in February that would have imposed sanctions on the Assad regime for using chemical weapons in previous attacks. He said that had sent a message of encouragement to Damascus. But by far the most dramatic and electrifying moment came when the Trump administration's new ambassador, Nikki Haley, spoke. She got up to her feet, which is rare in the Security Council, and she brandished photographs of the children who had died. And she asked very pointedly of the Russians, how many children need to die before Russia cares?
Nick Bryant at the UN headquarters in New York, thank you.
It left 75 people dead, 20 of them children. It injured hundreds more, terrified survivors hiding in shelters. Tonight, President Trump has called the suspected chemical weapons attack in Syria an affront to humanity, saying his attitude towards Syria and President Assad had now changed very much. But as the United Nations Security Council meets in emergency session, Russia and Syria are still denying responsibility. Our international editor, Lindsay Hilson, reports now, and a warning, some of the images are very distressing.
Overnight, emergency teams rushed as many of the injured as possible to hospitals in Turkey for treatment. Yesterday's attack on Khan Sheikhoun was different.
There was a rocket explosion that had a lot of smoke coming out of it. There was a lot of smoke, there was a smell. It was very difficult to breathe. We couldn't breathe anymore.
We were sleeping in our house, which was hit between 6 and 7 a.m. I went out to help people, and then they hit the building with a chemical weapon. There was a smell coming out. I had trouble breathing and fell to the ground immediately.
Rebel cameras filmed the alleged attack. The two large plumes of dark smoke on the left are conventional bombs. The smaller explosion on the right with white smoke is believed to be the chemical bomb. Khan Sheikhoun this morning. Russia, the Syrian government's main backer, says this wasn't a chemical attack by President Bashar al-Assad's forces, but a conventional bomb dropped on a rebel chemical weapons depot.
Syrian aviation launched a strike on a large terrorist ammunition depot and a concentration of military hardware on the eastern outskirts of Khan Sheikhoun. There were workshops at this site which produced chemical warfare munitions.
Nothing is sure until there's been an investigation, but the number and severity of casualties suggests it was a targeted attack. Chemical weapons experts doubt the Russian explanation, as nerve agents are not usually stored ready mixed, and if bombed, toxic substances would explode and dissipate. At the United Nations in New York, the US ambassador championed a resolution condemning the use of chemical weapons.
Yesterday morning, we awoke to pictures, to children foaming at the mouth, suffering convulsions, being carried in the arms of desperate parents. We saw rows of lifeless bodies, some still in diapers, some with visible scars of a chemical weapons attack. Look at those pictures. We cannot close our eyes to those pictures.
The French and British co-sponsored the resolution, which doesn't blame the Assad regime, but requires it to provide military flight plans, logs, and access to air bases for an investigation.
This doesn't look like the work of terrorists. This doesn't look like the work of the opposition. This bears all the hallmarks of the Assad regime, and the use of chemical weapons is a war crime.
Russia prepared to use its veto power, as it has on 7 previous occasions. The rescue of victims, the representative implied, could have been staged.
We should put an end to the very poor practice of long-distance investigations based on information that often is taken from the internet or from neighbouring countries.
I will now add this. When the United Nations consistently fails in its duty to act collectively, there are times in the life of states that we are compelled to take our own action.
But what action exactly? In 2013, the US and Britain declined to intervene in Syria after a similar chemical weapons attack. No one doubts that the poisoning of children is horrific. But Western politicians and publics do question whether Western military intervention is the answer.
Lindsay Hilson reporting there. Well, in the last half hour, President Trump has been speaking at the White House. Our Washington correspondent Kylie Morris was there. Kylie, what did you have to say about this?
Well, Matt, he was standing alongside King Hussein of Jordan in the Rose Garden and really spoke with some apparent passion about how affected, how shocked he was by these television images, particularly of beautiful little babies, as he described them, caught by this chemical attack, killed by this chemical attack in Idlib yesterday. I've got to say, yesterday the White House and the State Department were very slow to respond to this. The White House statement reflected more, in fact, on previous inaction by President Obama rather than laying the blame at the feet of President Assad. But today there was a different tone from the president. Not only did he convey how horrified he was, but suggested that this could change U.S. policy.
And I will tell you that attack on children yesterday had a big impact on me. Big impact. That was a horrible, horrible thing. And I've been watching it and seeing it, and it doesn't get any worse than that. And I will tell you, it's already happened, that my attitude toward Syria and Assad has changed very much. And if you look back over the last few weeks, there were other attacks using gas. You're now talking about a whole different level. I will tell you, what happened yesterday is unacceptable to me.
So I did shout out a question to the president, asking him whether this meant that he was now returning his focus to the removal of President Assad, which the policy was not last week, but he didn't answer.
And I gather that there are some changes afoot behind those gleaming whitewashed walls there behind you, especially regarding Steve Bannon, the chief strategist. Tell us about those.
That's right. Steve Bannon was noticeably absent from the Rose Garden for the press conference. He's normally there, perhaps a reflection of the fact that he's just lost his place on the National Security Council. This appears to be a win for H.R. McMaster, who's the National Security Advisor who replaced Mike Flynn. There was a real gnashing of teeth from the security and military establishment here in the US when Steve Bannon, who is after all the chief strategist, was elevated to sit on the National Security Council, which is the most important security strategic body in the White House advising the president. It does now seem he has been removed. The White House is saying it's because he was there to keep an eye on Mike Flynn, and Mike Flynn's no longer there, so he doesn't need to be there, which raises a whole other set of questions. But the short version of this is, yes, he's gone, and there'll be many generals and security advisors celebrating that.
Interesting. A bit of White House criminology there. John, over to you.
Well, now, joining us from Idlib province is Dr. Abdullah Tanari, who has been treating victims of the attack. From Salford is Yasmin Lahlawi of the Syrian advocacy group Rethink Rebuild, and from Whiteley by Jerry Smith, who led the UN-backed operation to remove Syria's chemical weapons back in 2013. Dr. Tanari, have you yet had those supplies you desperately need to treat the victims of this chemical attack?
Yes, in my hospital I had enough amount of antidote to treat the patient which I received.
Do you have any sense of how many injured people there are? We know there are about 75 dead, but how many injured do you think?
570.
570.
They were distributed to most hospitals in Idlib Governorate. My hospital received 22 patients. And treated all of them.
In an attack like this, how realistic is it for patients to actually recover completely?
So if the patient arrived to the hospital alive, maybe we can treat him. But most of the patients, they die before arriving to hospitals. They suffocate because of the huge amount of secretions in their lungs and because of the paralysis of their muscles, because of this nerve agent which was used. So they suffocate. If they reach the hospital, mostly they can be treated. We can intubate them and help them. But mostly they die before, on the way, during transportation and evacuation.
And have you had to treat chemical weapons victims before?
I treated chlorine gas victims many times before, but this first time we meet such kind of chemical weapons.
And do you know what the chemical was? Was it sarin?
So symptoms and the good response to the treatment make us suppose mostly it is sarin.
Jerry, I wonder if we could come to you, because you were actually involved in clearing sarin from that site in 2013 when Syria's chemical weapons were first removed. Do you have any way of seeing from this distance whether this could have been simply the hitting of a chemical weapons dump as opposed to a bomb from the sky?
Well, I think we need to be very conscious of all sort of playbooks that are being put out there at the moment. I think it's very premature if we start dismissing one accusation or another. What is clear from the video that I've seen is that people are suffering from some kind of intoxication. It would also appear that some of the signs and symptoms they have are consistent with that of nerve agents. Obviously with the doctor there, if they are responding to nerve agent treatment, that would indicate that that may well be the cause of the poisoning. It's too early really to tell about the scenarios. They're basically either Syrian jets hit a store, and I don't agree with your reporter that reported earlier with regards to the fact that that would absolutely consume all the sarin. That's not the case at all. If it is sarin was stored there and conventional munitions were used there, there is every possibility that some of those munitions were not consumed, and that in fact the sarin liquid was ejected and could well have affected the outstanding population. Of course, that conventional attack will still open up a whole bunch of questions of why the sarin was there, what it was doing there, who made it, and also why would Syria consider attacking a known chemical site with all the downstream issues of threatening a local population.
But would it be possible for the rebels themselves to have sarin?
Well, potentially. I mean, sarin is not an easy material to manufacture. But at the same time, it is not beyond the realms of possibility. Particularly some of the opposition groups out there, and particularly referring to Daesh, may well have a chemical weapon capability. But there are other options as well. It could have come from a part of the original Syrian stockpile. But that in itself then would raise questions of why that wasn't declared in the declarations in 2013 or subsequent amendments.
I'd like to come back to you in a moment, but I want to go to Yasmin Nalawi. Yasmin, there's President Trump apparently undergoing some kind of a change of heart on Syria. What do you want him to do?
Well, it's quite simple, really, John. What we want is civilian protection at the end of the day. We want to see that Syrians are not being killed by chemical weapons. We want to see that Syrian civilians aren't being killed by barrel bombs. We want to see hospitals protected. We want to see schools protected. We want to see people protected within their own cities without the threat of forcible displacement. And one point that should be made here is, you know, the Syrian conflict didn't just start right now. It is the worst attack that we've seen in a while. But the Assad regime has been using numerous methods over the past 6 years. Not least which was the displacement of East Aleppo, which happened in December 2016. Before that, there was an attack on the humanitarian aid convoy of 31 buses in September 2016. And before that, the forcible evacuation or displacement of Daraya. So to say that now is the change of heart is coming, I don't see how President Trump didn't see that before.
Well now, let me just ask you this. You want the civilian population protected. Does that mean you want UN troops on the ground?
If we see political will from the international community to do something about Syria, there are so many policy options. We've been presenting policy recommendations to the UK government over the past few years, and they can be as simple as get baby milk into besieged areas to implementing a no-bombing zone. The problem hasn't been the lack of policy options that are feasible or legal or in line with our national interests. The problem time and time again has been the absence of political will to get involved in the first place.
Okay, Jerry Smith, just very briefly, when you were clearing those weapons back in 2013, did you think fundamentally the country had been cleared of them, or it was always probable that there were other dumps?
Well, our task was very much to deal with the declaration that Syria gave, and given the circumstances that Syria came to the Chemical Weapons Convention, we had nothing to suggest that there was any other than a complete and utter declaration. Having said that, the OPCW, the guardians of the Chemical Weapons Convention, continue to look at various declaration issues, and that is still ongoing.
And just finally, Dr. Tanari, would you like to see some sort of intervention from the United Nations or indeed the United States on the ground?
We waited this intervention 6 years and we didn't see anything, just permission. I don't wait from them anything.
Dr. Tanari, thank you very, very much for joining us from Idlib, and thank you, Yasmin Nawalawi, for joining us from Salford, and indeed Jerry Smith. Thank you very much indeed for joining us, all three. Thank you.
We thought we had seen and heard the worst of it yesterday, but more images and more accounts of a gas attack have been emerging from a rebel Syrian town under fire from President Assad's forces. Watching them in the White House, President Trump said killing innocent babies with a chemical gas had crossed many lines. It had, he said, changed his attitude towards the Syrian regime. We'll hear from President Trump in a moment and assess what, if anything, will change in America's response. But first to those images and accounts from Idlib province of the attack, which has left at least 80 people dead, and they are, by their nature, distressing.
On the road that leads north out of Khan Sheikhoun, makeshift ambulances line up like they're on a starting grid. And this is a kind of race. A race for life.
Many civilians have been affected by the chemical.
This is a volunteer from Birmingham, Mohammed Sabir. He's driving people who were critically wounded in the gas attack to a place where they can get treatment that's going to stop them from dying. He's headed as fast as he can towards the Turkish border, where hospitals have been receiving the injured since last night. Here, the lucky ones regain consciousness and they start to remember. There was a rocket and smoke, says this woman, and then I couldn't breathe anymore. Back in Khan Sheikhoun, there's a different kind of shock and grief. Abdel Hamid had to bury his wife today, and their young twins, Aya and Ahmad.
When the first strike happened, I went out and saw everyone falling over. Some were running, some took a few steps and then fell. The gas was very strong.
At the clinic in Khan Sheikhoun, they are caring for youngsters who survived the airstrikes, which doctors here are in no doubt were carried out by the Assad regime. This doctor says the symptoms were consistent with the nerve agent sarin. Assad's government says it's never used chemical weapons, and today his ally Russia explained that the bombing raid hit a depot where rebels were keeping their own supplies of poison gas. On the ground here in Idlib, they say that is nonsense, and they're trying to gather evidence of what they describe as the latest war crime to be committed against their people. Perhaps this shrapnel will one day be presented in a courtroom, but from here, justice seems a long way away. Geraint Vincent, ITV News.
Well, it was only yesterday that President Trump was talking down his responsibilities as leader of the Western world, stressing he only wanted to be president of America. But something seems to have changed overnight after the Syrian attack. Not only did he say such heinous actions could not be tolerated, his ambassador at the United Nations hinted at America going it alone. That is pretty unlikely. But Ambassador Haley was trying to shame Russia into reversing its support for Assad, holding up pictures of dead children at today's Security Council meeting. Our next report also contains distressing pictures.
The horror of the images is abundantly, even shockingly clear. But the biggest question of all may be what impact the pictures have had on one man's view of the Syrian civil war.
The President of the United States.
For today, President Trump, meeting with King Abdullah of Jordan, suggested the atrocity had forced him to view the Assad regime in Damascus very differently, especially given the age of many of the victims.
Including women, small children, and even beautiful little babies, their deaths was an affront to humanity. These heinous actions by the Assad regime cannot be tolerated.
But that only raised the question, has the Syrian government now crossed a threshold with this White House? And might Trump launch a military strike?
That attack on children yesterday had a big impact on me. Big impact. And it's very, very possible, and I will tell you, it's already happened, that my attitude toward Syria and Assad has changed very much.
If that was a very personal but also highly ambiguous response, there was even greater outrage at an emergency session of the UN Security Council.
How many more children have to die before Russia cares?
Western ambassadors expressing their moral repulsion and saying Moscow, the primary backer of Assad, bore much of the responsibility.
When the United Nations consistently fails in its duty to act collectively, there are times in the life of states that we are compelled to take our own action.
And the British ambassador warned Russia that its support for the Damascus regime has now backfired.
And what does Russia get as repayment? Assad humiliates Russia in the eyes of the world.
As the diplomats argue with the Russian veto paralyzing the council, Syrian opposition leaders now say this is Trump's moment of truth.
This administration needs to learn the lessons. Assad doesn't hear any of the outrage, doesn't care about any moral condemnations. All he understands is force.
So would you favor a punishment strike by the United States now?
So it's quite simple to identify a few legitimate military targets of the regime and say there will be strikes against those. That's one option.
But this is a president who made a promise to American voters he would focus on domestic priorities.
Okay.
So whatever the impact of those Syrian images and of his meeting with King Abdullah, an America first, nationalist and isolationist is unlikely to want to get drawn into the Syrian quagmire within his first 100 days.
Well, Robert joins us now from Washington. He may have taken that position, Robert, but there has been a clear shift in his words and a strong intervention from the US ambassador to the UN. Can it amount to anything, and will it, do you think?
Well, look, Julie, this is an exceptionally difficult White House to kind of interpret and to understand and to predict. Even as a candidate, Donald Trump would talk about how unpredictability is a diplomatic and foreign policy asset. He would also often attack Obama for telegraphing his military strategy. So in truth, we actually don't have a good feel, don't really know whether this is a significant moment, a real pivot. Certainly until now, Trump has seen President Assad as a kind of a political reality, a fact on the ground, and he's wanted to deal exclusively and relentlessly with the Islamic State. Perhaps now he does understand that is too simplistic an approach. But, you know, we've said so often there are no good options in Syria. Any unilateral American strike obviously risks a confrontation with Russia and Iran, two countries heavily invested in defending the Assad regime. The UN is, of course, paralyzed by that Russian veto. And remember, too, Julie, you know, this is not the only crisis in this town. There are plenty of people in this administration who will tell you that North Korea is the more imminent and more urgent threat to the US.
Indeed, and we'll have more on that later on in the programme. Robert, thank you very much indeed for that.
Since the start of the Syrian civil war, adjectives of horror have gradually become worn out from overuse, not least from describing the brutality of Bashar al-Assad and his military. Listening to much of the reaction to yesterday's reports of a chemical attack, one could only be struck by the apparent powerlessness of the West to prevent cruelty on that scale. For some, Donald Trump was the problem. He'd shown a disregard for Syria and respect for Russia, offering Assad and Putin a licence to do their worst. But at 4:45 our time, a dramatic shift in approach. The US ambassador to the UN, Nikki Haley, made an excoriating attack on Russia and Assad with a suggestion the US might take unilateral action. The president himself also had strong words. So what does this say? That the administration is about to take a new and decisive step towards intervention, Or is that just words but no more? Well, here's David Grossman, and I should warn you, Ambassador Haley held up some graphic images of some of the victims of the attack yesterday, and they are included in his report.
About all everyone agrees on is that this was chemical weapons. Who carried it out, though? That is what is at issue. The Western powers, including Britain and supporters from the region, were congregating in Brussels today for yet another Syria conference. Here, a consensus on who's to blame is easy to find.
All the evidence I have seen suggests that this was the Assad regime who did it in the full knowledge that they were using illegal weapons in a barbaric attack on their own people.
What to do about it, though? The question that has eluded international agreement so many times, and every time the death toll in Syria has grown and grown. The UN Security Council has convened many times since Syria's barbaric civil war began, but nothing said in this chamber has paused the carnage even for a second. Russia, sometimes joined by China, has vetoed any concerted action. Today, yet another emergency session with the same strong condemnation from some round the table.
And yesterday, we saw the consequences of those vetoes. Those consequences are painted on the stricken faces of the children of Khan Sheikhoun.
Russia, meanwhile, is supporting and supplying President Assad. It contends that the chemicals were released when a rebel munitions store was hit by a Syrian government airstrike. The rebels, Russia says, are using the chemical weapons in an attempt to draw the US into the conflict.
The turning point in the use of toxic chemicals in Syria, and then following that, weaponized chemical agents, that turning point was the establishment by the previous U.S. administration of the so-called red lines. Crossing those red lines was supposed to lead to intervention, military intervention in the Syrian conflict. That decision served as a starting point for future provocations by terrorist and extremist structures with the use of chemical weapons.
It's impossible to say without independent scientists on the ground, but from this distance, the Russian explanation of a rebel chemical munitions store hit gets little support.
We wouldn't see this many deaths around. We wouldn't see this many suffrage around. This is for sure the government or the government affiliated agencies bombing the Idlib province and to the people deliberately using a nerve gas.
Foaming at the mouth, suffering convulsions.
America is convinced the US ambassador to the UN made sure the Russians and the Syrians could see pictures of some of the dead of Khan Sheikhoun, and she hinted at a stronger US response.
When the United Nations consistently fails in its duty to act collectively, there are times in the life of states that we are compelled to take our own action.
Thank you very much.
It seems that President Trump is in the process of recalibrating his Syria policy.
It crossed a lot of lines for me. When you kill innocent children, innocent babies, little babies.
Up to now, the president has seen so-called Islamic State as the bigger threat to American interests.
I think the president, as a result of this chemical weapons attack, has come to the conclusion that Syrian President Bashar al-Assad is a major asset for violent extremism.
But what follows from that realization, what the US can do to hurt the Assad regime without coming into conflict with Russian forces, is by no means clear.
David Grossman, well, new president, a different approach. Is this the first opportunity for President Trump to show what he can achieve, or the first sign that he's going to achieve little when it comes to influencing Russia and its allies? Joining me now from New York is the foreign policy strategist Nancy Soderberg, who served as Deputy National Security Advisor under President Clinton and as an ambassador to the UN. And a very good evening to you. Do you regard what happened today as a shift in American policy, a serious shift, or is it just more words?
I think it's a serious shift. President Trump cannot ignore the pictures that his UN ambassador was showing at the United Nations. And it's going to drive a wedge between him and President Putin, with whom he's been confusingly cozy. And he's got to come up with a policy that puts America on the right side of history here. We don't have one yet. We haven't seen it yet. But I think we're going to, one, try diplomacy, and two, perhaps we've got to do something about the remaining stockpile in Syria of those chemical weapons.
So just give us one option that you think is a viable or plausible option that he might now pursue.
Well, I think he's got to recognize that the Russian policy is a failure in Syria. They promised to get rid of the chemical weapons, and they haven't. So he's got to tough talk to Putin and say, we've got to solve this issue. One, defeat ISIS, and two, have a peace plan that rids the country of Assad. But that's a two-stage process that's going to be very, very difficult and require deft diplomacy, which we have yet to see from this team.
Right, but you see, when you describe that, that doesn't involve taking what I would have thought was unilateral action of going in and doing anything. Is it? That's just more talk and more diplomacy. And I wonder whether that won't leave America looking a bit weak, with Nikki Haley saying today, look, sometimes the time comes you just have to act on your own. Well, you look like you've caved again.
Well, no, I said that they're going to have to do something to get rid of those chemical weapons. And that could either involve the Russians going in and doing it, as they should have the first time they made this deal in 2013. They promised to get rid of all of it. Secondly, if they don't do it, I think the U.S. Would be justified in trying to capture that. But unilateral military intervention to get the chemical weapons is very, very difficult. So a negotiated effort with the Russians at front to make up their faulty deal in 2013, I think, will be first on the effort. But I think President Trump is very serious about taking action to address that chemical weapons threat if the international community, and particularly Russia, fails.
Just a very quick one. Nikki Haley in the United Nations pointed the finger very directly at Russia and talked about Russia. President Trump didn't mention Russia. He was talking about Bashar al-Assad. Now, is that an interesting distinction between the two of them? Do you think they're entirely on the same page on all of this?
No, I don't. And I think what Nikki Haley was trying to do at the UN is have her Adlai Stevenson moment, where, akin to the Cuban Missile Crisis, when our ambassador Adlai Stevenson showed for the first time those satellite pictures of Cuban missiles, of Russian missiles, Soviet missiles in Cuba. Here are the pictures. Here's the evidence. Now, like Khrushchev, you can't deny that this is the truth. So she's trying to corner the Russians. The president's not yet there, and our Secretary of State is mute. So I think they do not have a coordinated message here. I think they will get one, but it's a little bit on the confusing side now, and that's typical of this administration. They're not well coordinated with one message.
There are people who say sometimes being a bit unpredictable, a bit confusing, no one knows what the hell you're doing. That can be an advantage in some of these situations. You can get away with stuff that no one else will.
Well, and I think people believe President Trump when he says he's going to make sure that this is addressed alone if we have to. No one knows what, I don't think President Trump yet knows what that is exactly. But what this does is force President Trump to confront the Russian behavior, which he has been unwilling to do to date. There is no doubt that the Russians could move to stop this, didn't get all the weapons initially. They're pretending this is on the rebels. It's the same playbook they played in 2013 when this crisis happened before. The Russian policy is an absolute failure, and it opens a door for President Trump to actually try and get the Russians to do the right thing here. And given their relationship, he may be the one person that can actually pull that off. If he can pull that deal, then he will have accomplished something important. And that's, I think, going to be the first test of this presidency.
Nancy Soderberg, thank you very much indeed. Well, listening to that was Dr. Leslie Vinjam-Muri, an expert in conflict and US foreign policy at Chatham House and SOAS in London. Very good evening. Did you think this was a significant day when you heard President Trump say, I've changed my mind about Syria?
I think it is significant because, of course, what we saw President Trump do was to, in one sense, back himself into a corner. He's been critiquing Obama and the Obama administration for a very long time now on failing to enforce the red line. And he said many lines were crossed, many lines, and also more than a red line.
He's got to do something
So
now.
people are now going to be looking to see what he does. And of course, much of what Donald Trump has been doing in the last few months has been about his concern for his popularity at home. So that audience now, the expectations that that audience have has been raised. But she's exactly right. It's not very obvious what one does do. Russia has the greatest leverage over Assad, so that's extremely important. But whether Donald Trump actually has any leverage over Russia remains to be seen. And there's no real strategy that's coming out of the administration.
This is the most fascinating thing. Do you feel you've learned anything about Donald Trump and Russia? This is what everybody's been talking about for the last 4 months. Is the guy compensating for the fact that people think he's close to Russia? Does he have sway over Russia?
I think Donald Trump, when he spoke today about Syria and about the chemical weapons, the use of chemical weapons, again, I think he was speaking to a domestic audience, and I think he was launching a critique of the past administration. I think it was a little bit less about Russia, but of course now this puts him in a very difficult position because without Russia's help, there's not much you can do about Assad.
Can we, I mean, because everybody says that, can the US, the one thing I've heard described you could do is you could just go in and punish Assad for this. You could, so that he thinks about it the next time. You could just bomb an airfield or something like that. Not get in the way of the Russians, not get drawn into the fight, but just say, you did that, we do this, don't do it again. Now, is that plausible, or does Russia have control of the airspace in a way that means you couldn't venture in to do anything?
I mean, I think the key issue here is whether or not the current administration will think and deliberate carefully enough if they were to decide to use military force for the specific aim of taking out whatever chemical weapons remain in Syria, whether they would go through the kind of process that would be absolutely essential to achieve that. And that would not be an easy goal to achieve in any case. So I think that's an incredibly
You don't even know where the chemical weapons are, do you?
Yeah, and it's quite apart from the broader question, which is how to solve this crisis, this ongoing conflict in Syria. So there are two issues, and of course I think the American public is likely, those two issues are now going to come together in their mind.
Leslie Vinjam-Mary, thank you very much.
Thank you.
I've been getting away with it all.